Hey everyone, it's Blake. Today I'm going to talk a bit about framework debate. So I have a separate video about how to construct a framework, write a framework, and I also have videos about framework content, so like the basics of ethics video and then a video on Kant. Um, I'm working on those at the same time I'm working on this one, so if they're not uploaded quite yet, the basics of ethics and Kant video will be up soon. Um, but so this uh, video is going to focus on framework debate, so interaction between differing frameworks in a debate round. So instead of focusing on how to write a strong framework, there's a separate video for that. We're going to talk about when there's conflicting frameworks in a round. So I'm going to start with a really, really important piece of advice, and that is that in every circumstance, you should be weighing under every framing mechanism in the round. Um, I can't really think of an instance where this wouldn't be the case. Um, it's always going to be strategically to your advantage to implicate your impacts to as many framing mechanisms as possible. That is to say, if the AF is structural violence and the neg is util, then both debaters should be impacting their arguments to both structural violence and util. That just covers you so that if you lose the framework debate, you can still win the round because you have offense that still stands under the framework that is prevailed. So in pretty much every circumstance, you should be weighing under every framing mechanism in the round. So don't think that this video is telling you, like, here's the key to win your framework and win every round. No, there will be times when you lose the framework debate, and you can still win the round if you impact to the other person's framing. So, now on the subject of framework debate proper, the number one rule of framework debate that I like to use is that framework debate is comparative. Framework debate functions only if there is a clear point of comparison between the two frameworks. It's not enough to just say util is good, Kant bad. There needs to be some kind of connection between those justifications that functions on kind of a sliding scale of like why util is better or more preferable than Kant, not just util is good, Kant is bad, because then the opponent just gets up and says util bad, Kant good, and the debate is irresolvable for the judge, right? It's kind of like if you get up and you extend all of your impacts, but you don't weigh it all, and then your opponent gets up and extends all their impacts, but don't weigh it all. And so at the end of the round, it's like, okay, I have all of these impacts on the offense level, um, and I just have to kind of pick my favorite and intervene because you didn't do the weighing for me. It's the same thing with framework debate. If your metric of goodness and badness to the framework is not used in a comparative manner, the judge is going to have to make the call on what framework argument is most important to them, and that results in intervention. So, framework debate is comparative. So an example of what this looks like in practice is instead of getting up and saying prefer util because Kant is not accessible, this doesn't really tell me a reason why I like util. It just tells me that Kant is not good. So the next speech can just get up and say util is not accessible, and then there's no real clear winner of that debate, and it's irresolvable for the judge. So instead of saying that first argument, try wording it more like this: prefer util because it better accounts for differing subjectivities. That's the same argument in spirit, but it is implicated in a way that proves that util is actively desirable. Not just Kant is bad, we're left with util, but rather util is better than Kant in this way. And so every time you can implicate in this manner, you should implicate in this manner because framework debate is inherently comparative. If you're not doing the comparison work, the opponent is either going to do it and win the framework debate, or the judge will have to do it for you, and that's intervention, and nobody's happy with that result. So we talked about comparison is basically arguing why your framework is better or why your opponent's framework is worse. So here's just a couple of quick reasons why frameworks can be better or worse. So these are like common arguments you might see on frameworks. This is not an exhaustive list by any mean. There's about an infinite number of framework arguments out there, but some that are worth noting. Bindingness, that's how difficult it is to opt out of the moral obligation. So, a more binding moral theory is saying that it's uh, people are more likely to follow it because they are bound to it. Um, Moral theories that guide action. So, that's basically saying that it's not this abstract theory that is difficult to apply, but it's very clear in how it guides action. Inclusive versus exclusionary. So if there's any particular reason why a framework excludes a certain group or would not be accessible to everybody, all moral agents, then you would make an inclusivity argument. Real world versus not, which is basically in actual everyday life, is it feasible to use this moral framework to go about our lives? Or is it something that's very lofty and idyllic and not contextual to the real world? Practicality, which is, can I do that moral theory without wasting a ton of time and resources and blah 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 deciding if an action is moral or not? Theoretical justification, so this is like theory as in like T in theory, like fairness and education arguments, basically saying that this type of framework is more educational or more fair in the context of debate. There's actor specificity, which is basically arguing that the actor in the resolution, or whatever the advocacy is, most often in LD, that's like the U.S. government or international governments. And so actor specificity is saying that those specific actors would use this moral theory, or they would be able to use this moral theory. You can also argue that your moral theory solves X moral issues. So that's things like, is ought gap action theory, which are kind of like paradoxical propositions that say most morality fails because it cannot account for this issue. This issue becomes a paradox if you use X moral theory. And so saying that you avoid those moral issues can be a reason why your framework is better. Regress is basically saying that the idea behind the framework is regressive, meaning that it's kind of circular in thought, or it can ultimately be trailed back to another moral theory. So this is often used to justify why Kantian ethics is good, because you can say pretty much any moral theory regresses back to the question of why, which is practical reason. So that's just an example of what I mean by regress. And then objectivity is basically the nature of a moral framework being such that multiple actors would reach the same conclusion, as opposed to subjective, where different people will reach different conclusions, and you would argue that that is not a good situation, because if morality is different for different people, then there's nothing really holding society to a common set of rules. So those are just some quick definitions, common framework arguments. Put these things in your toolbox, but don't let them be constrictive. There's a lot more arguments that you can make. If you can think of it, go ahead and make it. So let's talk a little bit about basic strategy. So we're going to talk from the perspective of initiating a framework debate. So this would be something that the negative debater does. So obviously the AF, it's an expected burden of the AF that the AF is going to provide some kind of framework. So then the neg has the choice to either concede to that framework or initiate a framework debate by reading a different framing. And so we're going to use a little schematic to kind of walk through the decision-making process and how the decision made by the NC will shape the strategy of the framework debate and the round in general. Generally speaking, the AF side of framework debate is really just using like these kinds of arguments and doing the whole comparison thing that we talked about with the example before, with the Kant and util example. So we're going to focus on strategy from the perspective of the negative for the next several slides. So here is the basic schematic decision-making flowchart that I came up with. So again, this is just one way of doing this. I'm not saying that this is the process everybody takes. In fact, I would argue more people probably differ from this than follow this strictly. This is just something to help illustrate the point and hopefully help you understand so that you can have kind of a basic formula to use while you are sharpening your skills and eventually coming up with your own way of going about this. But the way that I like to explain this is that there's a series of decisions that you have to make. And we're going to take these step by step. So the first decision that you need to make is, do you, as the negative debater, need to read a counter framework? So the neg can absolutely win a round without reading their own framework. The AF speaks first, so they have to provide some kind of framing mechanism. So the neg can then choose to concede to that framing mechanism, or they can choose to read their own framework and contest the AF's framing mechanism. Now, technically, the 1AR can kick out of their own framework and go all in on the negs, so you could kind of squint at this flowchart and say that it applies to the AF as well by saying, instead of do I need to read a counter framework, saying do I need to engage in the framework debate or should I just kick out of my framework? So either side can absolutely win the round by while losing, quote unquote, the framework debate. For the neg, that would mean never reading a framework in the first place. For the AF, that would mean kicking out of their own framework in the 1AR. So CX is really critical to making this decision about whether or not you need to read a counter framework. You should always ask when you're unclear on a framework, how can I weigh under your framework? Your opponent can either give you a way to access the framing. They can either tell you weigh under my framework by XYZ, which then makes your impact analysis a lot easier, or they can admit that you cannot access their framing, which is then grounds for you to initiate a theory debate, theoretical voting issue, basically saying frameworks that are one-sided are bad for debate, kind of thing. But more often than not, the opponent is just going to give you a way to access their framing by explaining how you weigh under their framework. Another question that I like to ask is, if I prove that I do the action of the criterion / rule of the ballot better, do I win the round? So if I prove that I maximize expected well-being better, do I win the round? This is a question that should be an obvious yes, right? Like whoever better achieves the framework wins the round. But some debaters will try to get dodgy about this and say, well, not technically, because you'd also have to prove X, Y, Z. And so you just need to basically use this question to guide them towards admitting that weighing under their framework is a path to the ballot. So this is like a starter question for you to push them in that direction. So just to emphasize one more time, it is a completely valid strat to concede the framework debate and argue that you just outweigh under the opponent's framework. And I would even argue in many cases that is the right strategic decision. One thing that we definitely don't want to do, this is a little bit of a sidebar, but I don't think I have a slide on this anywhere. But if something that I see sometimes, especially for debaters that are just starting out, is that the AF will get up and read a framework and the neg will get up and read a different version of the same framework. So like both are reading util just with different cards justifying it. That's really a waste of time. If the AF gets up and reads the framework that you as the neg were going to read anyway, just concede to the framework and go straight to offense. But that's kind of a sidebar. The key takeaway from this slide is CX is really important in deciding whether or not you need to read a counter framework. Don't be afraid to concede the framework debate and just go all in on you outweigh on substance. So the second decision that we need to ask then is, how different will your framework be from the other framework that was read in the round? So we have kind of two options here. So you can either use the same foundation but with a different conclusion, or you can just go with a fundamentally different moral theory. So the examples I give is same foundation would be like util and structural violence. They are both consequentialist theories, but different conclusion. They disagree about what kind of consequences matter most. And that kind of framework argument where you say, I agree with the foundation, but I disagree on the conclusion, that's called a hijack. And then fundamentally different moral theories, think consequentialism versus deontology. They're just totally arguing different things to begin with. They're focused on different areas of ethics, and so there's like a fundamental contestation of the premise of the other moral theory. So I kind of call this the quote-unquote true framework debate method because a route because you are actually engaging in the ethical argument about like which foundation of ethics is correct. So I used true framework debate as just kind of a nickname really because there's not really a neater word for it that I know of, like an actual term. It's all framework debate. Everything in this PowerPoint is framework debate, but I just use this term for clarity's sake. So decision 2 is how different will your framework be? So frameworks are fundamentally syllogistic. I talk about this in the constructing a framework video. If you don't know what syllogistic means or what a syllogism is, I'll go through it. Like, I'm going to give you a very basic explanation, but if you want it more in depth, check out the constructing a framework video. Essentially, a syllogism is A leads to B leads to C, so the conclusion then is that A leads to C. So the example is that consequences matter, we should minimize harm, therefore util is the best. So if consequences matter, util is the best. So syllogisms are a way of basically mapping out a series of logical decisions or implications. So sometimes in the framework debate, we can agree up to a point, but disagree after that point, and that is considered a hijack. So that's like saying A does lead to B, but B actually leads to D, not C. So I agree that consequences matter. I agree that we should minimize harm, but util is not the best. Structural violence should be our priority. So that's a hijack. You're taking like the A to B part of the framework and you're saying, I'm going to take this and use it to justify my own framework. So it's a hijack. Sometimes we disagree with the foundation of the framework, which leads to a true framework debate. So we say that the original framework proposed that A leads to B leads to C, but A is completely false premise to start from. In reality, E leads to F leads to G. So the example in the context of debate of philosophy would be actually the premise that consequences matter is a flawed starting point. Instead, intentions matter, which means we should test the morality of our intentions, and Kant is then the best moral theory. So this is kind of to clarify the distinction between a hijack and a true framework debate. And it's really up to you to decide which you want to go with based on what your offense looks like, right? So if you only have consequentialist offense and the AF is deontological, you're going to have to go this quote-unquote true framework debate route. But if you have a bunch of util impacts on the neg and the AF is structural violence, you can get away with a hijack instead. So you just have to develop that strategic decision-making skill. That's not something where I can give you like a clear set of conditions under which you would do one or the other, but that's kind of a general way of, this is just a general framework of understanding how that works. So let's talk a little bit about how we would go about making this kind of hijack argument. So the first thing is that you should only read cards in your framework about the part where you differ from your opponent. So if the AF is util and the neg is structural violence, the AF implicitly agrees that consequentialism is good by reading a utilitarian framework, so the neg doesn't need to get up and waste time by saying consequentialism is good. They just need to get up and argue that structural violence is the best consequentialist theory. So what you're going to do is you're going to state where you agree with the opponent's framework for a proper hijack. You're going to get up and you're going to say, I agree consequentialism is good, or I agree we should use a non-ideal theory, or whatever the A to B premise of the AF framework is, and then you're going to explicitly call out where the two frameworks differ. So you're going to say, I agree that consequentialism is good and we should look to the consequences of our action to determine their morality. However, I would contend that the impacts of structural violence are the more important consequences than the impacts that utilitarianism is concerned with. And then you do the comparison that we talked about before. Explain why your framework is better, explain why their framework is worse, using all those metrics we talked about before, bindingness and actor specificity and inclusivity, exclusivity, all that kind of stuff. So to talk a little bit about going down this quote-unquote true framework debate route, so the first thing that you're going to want to do is strategic, in terms of strategic planning, is classify your opponent's framework. So in the Basics of Ethics video, which again, if it's not up yet, it will be up very soon, I define these kind of basic philosophical terms. These are like the classes that moral theories can fall into. So classify it, and from there, that'll help guide your argumentation, right? So if your opponent is reading a deontic, ideal, deontological moral theory, and you want to read a deontic, non-ideal, consequentialist theory, then you're going to start by arguing, non-ideal theory is better than ideal theory, and then go to consequentialism is better than deontology, and then get into the nitty-gritty of the specifics of the weighing mechanism you're going for. After you make those big picture philosophical arguments like ideal theory fails, or deontology can't guide action, or whatever those big philosophical arguments are, explain why your framework is better in practice using those metrics that we talked about earlier. So basically the big takeaway here is that in a true framework debate, you're probably going to be engaging in one of these big pictures, broad strokes philosophical debates. So here are some miscellaneous tips for answering weird frameworks, so frameworks that you've maybe never heard before. So CX is really key. You need to ask, how do I weigh under this framework? Remember, we talked about that earlier, because they can either provide you with an answer and say, this is how you weigh under this framework, or they can say, you can't weigh under this framework, which opens the door for you to go the theory route. You should also ask questions like, what does the ideal world look like according to your framework? Or what does it mean to do the role of ballot / criterion in everyday life? So like, what does it mean to foster the flourishing of virtue in everyday life? So you can basically use these kind of questions to get a more practical explanation of what the framework looks like. With these weird frameworks, classify them as best you can and contest them on philosophical levels. So think deontology versus consequentialism, ideal versus non-ideal, that kind of stuff. Make arguments about why weird frameworks are bad. Like, if a framework is something you've never heard before, there's probably a reason why people don't typically read it. So that might be that it's very confusing, right? So you should make the argument. You should literally say to the judge, if they don't explain the framework in a way that is understandable, you cannot vote on it. You can also make the argument, like on a substantive level, that if you can't explain the framework to somebody like a 10-year-old, it's probably too complicated to assume everyone can use it to guide action, so it's probably not a good decision-making metric. Really, really importantly, with weird framework debates, find out how you can meet their framework. Because most debaters who read weird and unique frameworks are not expecting the opponent to engage on the substance level. They are expecting it to be a framework debate. So the most surprising and strategic thing you can do is say, okay, I see your framework, I'm going to engage with you on substance, and they're going to be less equipped to handle that. Some final thoughts on the subject of the framework debate. Again, some reminders: always weigh under every framing mechanism in the round, and framework debate is inherently comparative. Make sure that you answer the framework that is read, not just what it's titled. So like, just because it is a Kant framework doesn't mean that it is an exact copy and paste of the Kant framework you've debated in the past. So make sure you're answering the specific warrants and use cross-ex to get clarification, and read the important text like the role of the ballot and the criterion and that kind of stuff. Leverage your framework cards on other flows. So implicate the arguments using cross applications. Don't just read your framework and then use that to justify why your framework is good and then never touch it on the other flow. Remember that framework debate is comparative, which means there's a lot of crosstalk between the flows. So you should be saying, cross-apply my card that says ideal theory fails to the opponent's framework. So leverage your framework on other flows, and uplayer when possible. So a good argument that you can make is that reading a framework that justifies a morally reprehensible thing is a pre-fiat voting issue. So that's a way of uplayering and kind of covering yourself, so that even if you lose the framework debate and even if you lose the substance debate, you can still win the round because you uplayered and provided a pre-fiat voting issue. So that's all I have for this video. As always, let me know if you have any questions, leave a comment, or reach out or anything like that. Hopefully this was helpful, and I will see you soon.